My name is Rebecca Caldwell. I'm 33, and I work as a senior title examiner in Charlotte, North Carolina. My job is to find the one line in a property file that can stop a major deal from closing. I never expected my husband to put documents in front of me and hope I would not read them carefully. A few nights earlier, I went to a project preview for Graham's firm. It was an important night for him, so I showed up ready to support him. Although lately I felt more like a guest in his professional life than his wife. Graham spent the evening beside Whitney Dalton, his director of development partnerships, talking with lenders and investors while I stood nearby. When one investor asked about the old warehouse where Graham's company had started, Graham smiled and said I was great with paperwork. But he and Whitney handled the real development decisions. I laughed because everyone else did, but something in me tightened. A few minutes later, Whitney mentioned converting the warehouse into a leasing office after the flagship project was finished. I looked at Graham because no one had discussed that plan with me, and the warehouse was mine. He noticed my expression and told me not to turn a business event into something personal. Graham came home late the next night and placed a folder on our kitchen counter. He said the lender needed a marital acknowledgement before closing and called it technical paperwork. I was tired, so I left the folder there until morning. Then I made coffee, opened it, and started reading the way I read every file at work. On page 17, I found the legal description for my warehouse. It appeared under additional collateral, followed by language saying owner consent was pending execution. I read it 3 times because I wanted to be certain I understood what I was seeing. Graham had not asked me to acknowledge our marriage. He was asking me to put my property into his deal. The warehouse was never a wedding gift, and Graham knew that. I bought it 2 years before we married, when the neighborhood around it was still mostly repair shops and empty brick buildings. I had saved for years, used nearly everything I had for the down payment, and signed the first commercial loan alone. Back then, Graham joked that the building was the only thing in our relationship more stubborn than I was. When his development company was still small, I let him rent part of the warehouse for far less than market value. It made sense because we were building separate careers and trying to help each other where we could. Those first years were good, and I never kept score over who contributed more. Graham always called it my building then, and he never acted confused about whose name was on the deed. That changed slowly as his company grew. My building became our headquarters when he talked to clients, then one of our early properties when he spoke at industry events. I corrected him a few times, gently, because I thought the wording was careless rather than intentional. He would laugh, kiss my forehead, and say everyone knew what he meant. I believed him because there had never been a reason not to. Whitney joined the company about a year before the project preview. She was smart, ambitious, and involved in decisions Graham once brought home to discuss with me. Gradually, I started hearing about those decisions after he and Whitney had already made them. I told myself that was normal as the company expanded, but it still felt strange hearing a woman I barely knew talk confidently about property she did not own. I went back to the closing package and found the collateral schedule again. There was my warehouse, identified by the exact parcel number I had memorized years earlier, followed by language stating that owner consent was pending execution. That phrase bothered me because pending suggested someone had already promised my signature was coming. I had never made that promise, so I sat there wondering who had made it for me without asking me. I did not start by looking for proof of an affair. I started with the part I understood best, the property itself. I pulled the deed, the documents Graham had sent me whenever his company discussed using the warehouse. Nothing showed that I had transferred it, pledged it, or authorized anyone else to speak for me. Then I checked the public filings tied to Graham's redevelopment project. The warehouse was not listed as company property, and it had never been placed inside any entity Graham controlled. That should have ended the question, but it did not explain why a lender believed my consent was on the way. I kept going because someone had given them that expectation. A few months earlier, Graham had emailed me a project deck because he wanted my opinion on the property descriptions. I still had the chain. While reviewing it, I found a newer version that a lender consultant had accidentally forwarded when replying to both of us. In that version, my warehouse was described as committed secondary collateral, even though I had never agreed to that language. That detail made the project preview feel different in my memory. Whitney had spoken about turning the warehouse into a leasing office after the flagship project was complete, like the decision had already been made. At the time, I thought she was repeating one of Graham's ideas. Now I wondered whether he had told her the property was already part of the plan. I called Diane Keller, a real estate attorney who had no connection to my employer or Graham's company. I sent her the deed, the closing package, and the emails I had found. She told me not to argue about Whitney, not to threaten the project, and not to make assumptions I could not prove. First, she wanted one answer from me. Had I ever agreed to use the warehouse as collateral? I told her no. Not even once. Diane said that made the property issue much simpler than the marriage issue. Then she asked whether Graham had ever told me the lender had already underwritten the deal, assuming my building would be available. He had not. And that was the moment I understood this was no longer a careless line in a closing package. I waited until Graham came home and asked him one question at the kitchen table. Why was my warehouse listed as collateral in a loan package I had never approved? He barely looked surprised. He said nothing was final. Lenders always asked for backup, and this was normal for a deal of that size. I asked when I had agreed to mortgage the building. Graham leaned back and told me we had talked for years about supporting each other's businesses. He said the closing was only days away. The company had already spent months preparing, and everyone was counting on us. Then he said I was turning routine paperwork into a crisis. I kept my voice level and asked what he had told the lender I had agreed to. He did not answer that question. Instead, he said I needed to trust him and stop assuming every decision he made was somehow against me. I told him trust did not change whose name was on the deed. That was when Whitney entered the conversation without me bringing her up. Graham said Whitney understood what was at stake and had spent months helping him keep the project alive. I asked why Whitney knew anything about the future of property she did not own. His expression changed, and he accused me of being jealous because Whitney was his business partner. I told him this was not about where Whitney stood beside him at an event. It was about why my property was standing inside his loan package. For a few seconds, he had nothing to say. Then he told me I was too emotional to discuss it, and that he would give me time to calm down. He grabbed his jacket and left the house. I sat at the table with the closing package in front of me and understood something I had missed before. Graham still believed this was pressure, not permission. He thought enough time, urgency, and guilt would eventually make me sign. I opened my laptop and emailed Diane every page of the package. I asked her to prepare a written notice stating that I had never pledged the warehouse and had never authorized anyone to say otherwise. I did not ask her to stop Graham's project. I asked her to make one fact impossible to misunderstand. Diane sent the notice that morning to the lender and closing attorney. It was narrow and factual. I was the sole titled owner of the warehouse. I had not pledged it, and I had never authorized anyone to represent that my consent was secured. Less than an hour later, the lender placed the closing on hold while they reviewed the collateral structure. Graham called me before lunch. He said I had put months of work at risk and demanded to know why I had not come to him first. I reminded him that I had asked what he told the lender, and he had answered with a lecture about trust. I told him I had not stopped his deal. I had corrected one assumption involving property that belonged to me. That afternoon, Caleb Morgan contacted me. He said he was trying to understand what the company had relied on when the financing model was built. I did not mention Whitney or anything happening in my marriage. I sent him an old email where Graham had asked whether I might someday consider putting the warehouse into a broader portfolio, along with my reply saying I was not comfortable doing that. Caleb thanked me and said nothing else. The next day, Whitney asked to meet me at a coffee shop near her office. She did not apologize, and I did not expect her to. She wanted to know why I had suddenly pulled the warehouse from the deal after agreeing to contribute it months earlier. I told her I had never contributed it. For the first time since I had met her, Whitney looked confused. She said Graham told her my approval had already been settled and only the paperwork remained. Then she added that he had also told her our marriage was over and that we had separated everything except the filing. I asked when he had told her that. The timeline reached back into months when Graham and I were eating dinner together, planning holidays, and sleeping in the same bed. That was when the affair became clear without me asking for details. What mattered just as much was the pattern underneath it. Graham had told the lender my signature was coming, told Caleb the property was available, and told Whitney I had already stepped out of both the marriage and the warehouse. 3 people had been given 3 versions designed to keep them moving in the direction he wanted. Graham's next move was to make me the reason the project was in trouble. He sent an email to Caleb and several project partners saying I had supported the redevelopment from the beginning, but withdrew my property after a personal dispute. He framed the missing collateral as an emotional decision made at the last minute. That mattered because my career depended on being seen as careful, factual, and professional. I did not answer his email myself. Diane and I built a timeline from documents that existed before I knew about Whitney. We had the original deed, my earlier emails refusing to transfer the warehouse, a financing memo signed only by Graham, and the closing package he gave me days before closing. None of those documents showed that I had ever promised the property. A meeting was scheduled with Graham, Caleb, the lender's attorney, Diane, and me. Graham said we had discussed using the warehouse for years and that everyone understood I supported the plan. I told him we had discussed plenty of ideas over the years. Then I asked him to point to one document where I had agreed to pledge the building. He could not. Caleb asked why the financial model treated the warehouse as secured collateral if the owner had never consented. Graham started talking about timing, staff assumptions, and misunderstandings with the lender. Then the lender's attorney opened an email Graham had sent weeks earlier stating that the owner's signature would be delivered before closing. The room went quiet because the timeline no longer depended on anyone's memory. Graham tried to explain that he expected me to sign because I had always supported the company. Diane asked whether expectation and authorization were the same thing. He did not answer directly. Caleb looked less angry than disappointed, which somehow made the moment worse. Whitney learned during the same review that Graham had told her my consent was already complete. She did not defend him after that. She also did not suddenly take my side. She simply withdrew her name from a personal guarantee Graham wanted her to sign for the revised financing. Without my warehouse and without Whitney's guarantee, the project could not close under the original structure. The deal was not dead, but it had to be rebuilt. For the first time, Graham was dealing with consequences he could not explain away as my emotions. I did not take Graham's company away from him. I stopped letting him build it with things that had never belonged to him. Caleb and the investors found another source of equity and a different property to support the financing. The project survived, but the delay cost time, money, and trust that could not be replaced as easily. When the revised deal moved forward, Caleb became the lead contact with the lender and investors. Graham kept his ownership stake, but he lost control of the financing decisions he had treated as his territory. No one announced that he was finished. They simply stopped letting his word carry the weight it used to. Whitney pulled away from him too. Once she understood that he had told her my consent was complete, while telling me the warehouse was only a routine possibility, she stopped defending his judgment. I did not ask whether their relationship ended that week or later. By then, I had stopped measuring my life by what happened between them. I gave Graham formal notice that his company would need to leave the warehouse when the existing lease period ended. After that, anything involving the property went through written communication. Our marriage went through attorneys as well. The affair mattered, but I no longer needed to argue about it because the larger problem was clear. During settlement talks, Graham offered to buy the warehouse from me. He said keeping it connected to the company would make everything simpler. I told him simple, for him, was not the same as right for me. He kept his equity in the development firm. I kept the warehouse, and we agreed to sell the house we had shared. At one mediation session, Graham asked if I was really ending our marriage over a building and one mistake. I looked at him and said the building showed me what he was willing to decide for me. Whitney showed me it was not the first thing he had already decided without me. He did not answer. That was the part I finally understood. I was not taking his future away. I was taking my permission back. For years, he had treated my support like a standing promise. I finally understood that it was not one anymore. 9 months later, the divorce was final, and the warehouse was still mine. I renovated part of it into 2 commercial units and leased them at market rates. The building was not helping someone else build a future I had never agreed to. It was giving me something steady that I could control. At work, Eliza asked me to lead a commercial review team. She reminded me the promotion had been discussed long before my marriage ended. I did not want my life to improve because something painful happened. I wanted it to improve because I kept doing my job well. A few weeks later, I saw Graham at an industry luncheon. He looked tired, but not ruined. And I was glad because I did not need him destroyed to know I had made the right decision. He said he understood why I refused to sign, but believed things could have been different if I had talked to him sooner. I told him I had talked to him. He had been counting on me changing my answer. I left the luncheon and drove back to the warehouse. One of the tenants was hanging a sign above the entrance, and I stood across the parking lot watching. I thought about the closing binder I had kept and the legal description on page 17. A few lines on paper had forced me to see how much of my silence Graham had mistaken for permission. I used to think keeping the peace meant knowing when not to argue. Now I know peace only matters when both people are allowed to choose it. Love can include compromise, but compromise is not consent given in advance. If someone keeps deciding for you because you supported them before, silence can become the easiest tool they have. If this story stayed with you, tell me when you think Graham crossed the line. Like the video if you believe trust never replaces consent. And subscribe for more stories about choices, consequences, and deciding for yourself again.